It was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't distract, it exposes. Ethan sat alone, scrolling through an article. Nothing unusual at first, just another piece on personality, behavior, self-awareness. Then one line stopped him. Some of the most dangerous traits don't look dangerous. He read it again, slower this time. The words didn't feel dramatic, they felt accurate. Because nothing in his life looked extreme. No chaos, no obvious manipulation, no cold behavior. Everything felt normal, controlled, balanced. And that's what made the line uncomfortable. Because if something dangerous doesn't look dangerous, how would you even recognize it? Ethan leaned back slightly, thinking, not emotionally, structurally. Across the room, Daniel stood near the window, silent as always, watching nothing but aware of everything. Ethan glanced at him briefly. There was something about Daniel that never shifted, calm, controlled, unreadable. Not cold, but not open either. And in that moment, the thought surfaced quietly. What if I don't fully understand myself the way I think I do? Because the most dangerous patterns are not the ones you see, they're the ones you operate without noticing. Ethan had always seen himself as balanced, rational, fair, not overly emotional, not overly aggressive. He didn't manipulate people, didn't seek unnecessary attention, didn't act impulsively. At least that's how he understood himself. He made decisions logically, spoke clearly, avoided unnecessary conflict. And in most situations that worked. People saw him as reliable, stable, easy to work with. And that reinforced his belief that he was normal, not extreme in any direction. But over time, small patterns started becoming visible. Moments where he adjusted how he spoke, depending on who he was speaking to. Times where he held back information, not because it was wrong, but because it was useful to keep. Situations where he stayed emotionally neutral, even when others were reacting strongly. None of it felt wrong. It felt efficient, controlled. But when he looked at it more closely, a question started forming. Is this just normal behavior or something else? Because the line between control and manipulation is not always obvious, and the line between emotional stability and emotional detachment is even harder to see. Daniel was different, not in a visible way. He didn't stand out, didn't dominate conversations, didn't seek attention, but there was something about him that never shifted. He didn't react the way others did. In tense situations, he remained steady. When people argued, he observed. When pressure increased, his expression didn't change. Ethan had noticed it before, but never focused on it this deeply. It wasn't just calmness, it was control, the kind that didn't require effort, the kind that didn't fluctuate, and more importantly, the kind that didn't reveal anything unnecessary. You couldn't tell what Daniel was thinking, you couldn't predict how he would respond, and because of that, people adjusted around him, not consciously, but consistently. They were more careful, more measured, because uncertainty creates attention. Ethan realized something subtle here. Daniel wasn't powerful because of what he did openly. He was powerful because of what he didn't reveal. And that made him harder to read and harder to influence. The deeper Ethan looked, the clearer the pattern became. People don't fully understand themselves, not because they lack intelligence, but because they observe intention more than behavior. They focus on what they mean to do, not what they actually do. I didn't manipulate, I just explained differently. I wasn't seeking attention, I just wanted clarity. I wasn't being cold, I was being logical. The mind reframes behavior to protect identity. And over time, those reframes become belief. That's how blind spots form, not through ignorance, but through interpretation. Ethan saw this clearly now. His actions were consistent, but his interpretation of them was selective. He wasn't lying to himself, but he wasn't seeing everything either.
And that's the gap between behavior and awareness. That's where hidden traits exist, not obvious, not extreme, but present. And once you start noticing them, they don't feel external anymore. They feel familiar.
As Ethan sat with that thought, the idea started becoming clearer. This wasn't about good or bad. It was about structure. There are certain personality traits that don't look extreme, but shape behavior deeply. In psychology, they're grouped together, not as disorders, but as tendencies, patterns that exist in normal people. The three most studied are known as the Dark Triad, not because they are evil, but because they operate below awareness. The first is Machiavellianism, strategy, control, the ability to influence situations without revealing intent. The second is Narcissism, not arrogance in its obvious form, but the quiet need to be recognized, to feel above average, to be seen. And the third is psychopathy, not violence, but emotional detachment, the ability to stay unaffected when others react. Ethan didn't feel shocked hearing this because none of it sounded extreme. It sounded familiar, and that's what made it uncomfortable. These weren't traits of other people. They were patterns that could exist inside anyone. The deeper Ethan looked, the more the idea shifted. These traits were not exceptions, they were distributions. Everyone had them, just in different levels. Some people used strategy more, some needed validation more, some detached emotionally more easily, but no one was completely free of them. That's the part most people avoid, because it's easier to believe that manipulation belongs to manipulators, that ego belongs to arrogant people, that emotional coldness belongs to extreme personalities. But reality is more subtle. A small adjustment in how you present something is still influence. Wanting recognition, even quietly, is still ego. Choosing logic over emotion, even when it affects others, is still detachment. Ethan realized something critical here. These traits don't appear as extremes, they appear as normal behavior. And because they look normal, they go unnoticed. That's why they are powerful, not because they are obvious, but because they are hidden in plain sight. Ethan started replaying his own behavior, not with judgment, but with clarity. There were moments he had adjusted conversations, not to deceive, but to guide outcomes, changing how he framed information, choosing what to emphasize, what to leave out, not aggressively, not visibly, but strategically. At the time, it felt logical, efficient, necessary, but now it looked different, because the intention behind it became clearer. It wasn't just communication, it was influence, controlled influence. And that's what Machiavellianism looks like in real life. Not manipulation in its extreme form, but quiet control over direction. Ethan didn't feel like he had done something wrong, but he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Because once you see it, it becomes obvious. The question wasn't whether he had used it. The question was how often, without noticing. Then came the second layer, narcissism. Not in the loud sense, not attention-seeking, but quieter, more controlled. Moments where recognition mattered, where being seen as capable felt important, where a lack of acknowledgement created subtle discomfort. Ethan thought about it carefully. Times when his work wasn't noticed, when someone else received credit, when his contributions stayed in the background. He didn't react openly, but internally there was a shift, a tension, a sense that something was missing, not fairness, recognition. And that's how narcissism appears in most people, not as arrogance, but as sensitivity to perception, the need to be seen correctly, the need to not be overlooked. Ethan realized something subtle but powerful here. Ego doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it just reacts quietly. The third layer was harder to accept because it didn't look negative, it looked like strength. Ethan thought about situations where others reacted emotionally, stress, conflict, pressure, and he didn't. He stayed calm, focused, logical. At the time, it felt like control, like maturity, but now he looked deeper. There were moments where someone was affected, and he chose not to engage emotionally, not because he didn't understand, but because it wasn't necessary for the outcome. He prioritized efficiency over empathy, stability over emotional connection. And that's what mild psychopathy looks like in real life. Not cruelty, not lack of awareness, but the ability to detach when it serves a purpose. Ethan realized something uncomfortable here. Emotional control and emotional detachment can look the same from the outside, but internally they are not identical. One manages emotion, the other bypasses it.
At this point, the patterns were no longer abstract, they were personal. Ethan leaned back again, but this time the silence felt different. Not calm, but active. Am I actually as balanced as I thought? The question didn't come with fear, it came with precision. Because now, every behavior had a second layer. When he stayed calm, was it control or detachment? When he influenced a situation, was it communication or strategy? When he wanted recognition, was it fairness or ego? The lines weren't clear anymore, and that uncertainty created tension. Not emotional tension, structural tension, because identity depends on clarity, and right now, that clarity was shifting. Ethan wasn't discovering something new, he was reinterpreting something that had always been there, and that made it harder to ignore. Because once you question your own patterns, you can't go back to seeing them the same way. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. He always did. Ethan didn't say anything, but his focus had changed, more internal, more precise. As Daniel passed by, he stopped briefly, not looking directly at him, just enough to acknowledge awareness. "You're not different," he said calmly. Ethan looked up, slightly confused. "Then what is this?" he asked. Daniel paused, just for a second. "Awareness," he replied, then added, "You were always like this." That line stayed because it removed the illusion completely. Nothing had changed, no new traits had appeared, no transformation had happened. The only thing that changed was visibility. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Daniel added one more line before walking away. "Most people don't see it." And just like that, the conversation ended, but the meaning stayed. This wasn't about becoming something new, it was about seeing what was already there. That's when Ethan found it. Not randomly, but at the exact moment he was ready to see it. A structured self-assessment, not opinion-based, not emotional, measurable, direct, a way to quantify patterns that usually stay hidden. He didn't hesitate, because at this point, the question wasn't whether the traits existed, it was how much. The test didn't feel like a judgment, it felt like a mirror. Each question simple but precise, not asking who he thought he was, but how he actually behaved. And that's what made it different, because behavior doesn't lie the way interpretation does. Ethan understood something critical here. Self-awareness is not built through thinking, it's built through measurement. And this was the first time he had a structure that didn't depend on his own perception, it depended on his patterns. As Ethan looked at the structure of the test, something deeper started forming. These traits weren't random flaws, they weren't mistakes in human behavior, they existed for a reason: survival, adaptation, competition. In earlier environments, being purely honest, purely emotional, or purely passive wasn't always effective. People needed strategy to navigate complexity. They needed ego to protect their position. They needed detachment to make decisions under pressure. These traits didn't emerge as problems, they emerged as tools, and over time they became part of normal personality structures. The issue wasn't their existence, it was their regulation. Daniel had never tried to eliminate these traits. He controlled them, used them when necessary, suppressed them when not. That's the difference. Ethan realized something critical here.
darkness is not abnormal, lack of awareness is. Because once a trait is unconscious, it controls behavior. But once it is seen, it can be directed. Ethan started going through the test carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just observing his own responses. Each section revealed something different. The first focused on control, how often he influenced situations, how comfortable he was adjusting information, how much he relied on strategy instead of transparency. The second focused on ego, not arrogance, but internal expectations, recognition, position, the need to not be overlooked. And the third focused on detachment, how easily he could separate from emotion, how unaffected he remained in situations where others reacted. None of the questions felt extreme. That was the point. They were designed to capture normal behavior, not rare cases, and that's what made it accurate. Ethan noticed something subtle here. The test wasn't asking who he wanted to be, it was measuring who he actually was, and that difference was everything.
As Ethan answered each question, patterns started forming. Not isolated answers, but consistent tendencies. He could see where he leaned toward control, where he adjusted situations more than he admitted. He could see where recognition mattered more than he acknowledged, where being overlooked created a quiet internal reaction. And he could see where he detached, where he chose logic over emotion, not because it was always right, but because it was effective. None of it felt extreme, but none of it felt neutral anymore either. That's the shift. Self-awareness doesn't create new behavior, it reveals existing patterns. And once those patterns are visible, they can't be ignored. Ethan wasn't becoming someone else, he was becoming aware of who he already was, and that awareness created a new kind of control. Ethan paused before calculating the results, not because he was unsure, but because he understood what this meant. Numbers don't interpret, they reveal. Once the scores were calculated, there would be no reframing, no soft interpretation, just structure. Across the room, Daniel remained where he was, silent, observing, not asking what the result would be, because he already understood something Ethan was just realizing. The result wouldn't change who he was, it would only remove the illusion of neutrality. Ethan looked down at the responses again, calm, focused. No hesitation now, because the question had shifted. It was no longer, am I like this? It was, how much? And once you ask that question, the answer becomes unavoidable. Ethan finished the calculation. No hesitation, no second guessing, just numbers, clear, structured. And for a moment, nothing happened. No shock, no reaction, just silence. But not empty silence, a different kind. The kind where something settles internally. Because the result didn't surprise him, it confirmed something. He wasn't neutral, he wasn't purely rational, he wasn't as balanced as he had assumed. He had patterns, measurable ones, strategy in how he handled situations, a need for recognition, even if controlled, a level of detachment that helped him stay stable, but also created distance. None of it was extreme, but none of it was absent either. That's the truth. Not dramatic, not emotional, just precise. Across the room, Daniel didn't move, because this wasn't a revelation to him. It was a confirmation Ethan had finally reached. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in behavior, but in awareness. Because once you see your patterns clearly, they stop feeling accidental. The change didn't show on the surface. Ethan didn't act differently immediately, but the way he saw things changed completely. He stopped dividing people into simple categories: good, bad, honest, manipulative. Instead, he started seeing patterns, levels of control, degrees of ego, variations of detachment, and that made behavior predictable, not perfectly, but structurally. When someone adjusted a conversation, he saw the intent behind it. When someone sought recognition, he understood the need driving it. When someone stayed emotionally distant, he recognized the function it served. That's what awareness does. It removes illusion.
not by making things more complex, but by making them clearer. Ethan realized something subtle but powerful. People don't act randomly, they follow patterns, and those patterns are measurable. Later, Ethan sat with the realization in its simplest form. The Dark Triad traits are not problems by default, they are tools. Strategy allows control. Ego drives positioning. Detachment enables stability under pressure. None of these are inherently negative. What matters is regulation. Because uncontrolled, they become destructive. Manipulation becomes exploitation. Ego becomes arrogance. Detachment becomes indifference. But controlled, they become advantages, quiet ones, invisible ones. The difference is awareness. Ethan understood something deeper now. You don't remove darkness, you understand it. And once you understand it, you decide how much of it to use. That's the system truth. Power doesn't come from being purely good. It comes from knowing how to manage what is not. The environment hadn't changed. Same people, same conversations, same structures. But Ethan wasn't seeing it the same way anymore. He wasn't reacting to behavior, he was reading it. He wasn't assuming intention, he was observing patterns, and that changed everything. His responses became more controlled, not forced, but precise, because now he understood both sides, the visible behavior and the hidden structure behind it. Ethan walked through the same space, but with a different awareness, not trying to prove anything, not trying to be seen a certain way, just understanding. Because in the end, you're not dangerous because you have dark traits. You're dangerous because you don't know how much of them you're using. If this made you see something you couldn't see before, subscribe, because most people never notice the patterns that are controlling them.